Racist cop arrests black woman, discovering she's the head of civil rights officer. Matt Grayson's patrol car crept through the dimly lit streets, the tires humming against the pavement of the quiet, predominantly black neighborhood. His eyes darted from one dark corner to the next, always searching for something to justify his presence. It was late, the stores long closed, and the streets eerily still. That's when he saw her, a woman, walking alone, a few steps away from a boarded-up store. Her posture was upright, her pace steady, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Elena Carter, he would learn later, was 33, tall and composed. But in that moment, she was just another face in the night to Matt. He slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. He threw open the door, his boots hitting the ground with a force that echoed in the silent streets. "You! Stop right there," he ordered, his voice hard. Elena glanced at him, unfazed, then stopped. She didn't immediately turn toward him, but her body language shifted, showing no fear, no hesitation. "What's going on, officer?" Elena asked, her voice calm, but with a subtle firmness. "You're loitering here," Matt snapped, stepping closer. "What's your business?" Elena glanced at the empty street. "I'm walking home, that's all." Matt's eyes narrowed. "Uh-huh. Out here at this hour?" His tone shifted, dripping with suspicion. "Something doesn't feel right." He wasn't asking questions, he was assuming. He took another step, his hand reaching for his cuffs. "I'm just walking home," Elena repeated, her eyes steady on his. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Matt didn't care. He moved forward, grabbing her arm. "I said, stop resisting." She didn't resist, but as his handcuffs clicked into place, she spoke softly, almost as an afterthought. "You don't know who you're arresting?" Matt paused for a second, his grip tightening. He didn't understand what she meant. He didn't care to. He simply shoved her forward, ignoring the oddity of her words. His mind was set. She was just another problem to manage. At the station, Matt filed the paperwork, confident. He had done his job, caught another troublemaker. As the paperwork piled up in front of him, he didn't notice the whispers, the silent ripple that moved through the room as the woman's name, Elena Carter, began to surface. He was focused on one thing: getting through the night. And in his mind, he had done just that. Elena sat in the holding cell, her back pressed against the cold metal bench. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows against the stark white walls. Her hands were still cuffed, but she sat with an air of calm, as if she had been here before. Her mind drifted, replaying moments from her life, her childhood in this very neighborhood, watching her father fight for justice and his life until the day he was taken by a system that claimed it was there to protect. The years of law school, working long nights, studying, arguing, and climbing her way up the ladder, only to become a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. A voice that now lay behind bars for no other reason than the color of her skin. The memory of the system's cruelty cut deep. She had faced it before, but it was never easy. The hidden bias in every courtroom, the silent stares in every meeting room. She had fought those battles with her words, with her strength, with everything she had. But now, she was being treated as the very thing she had spent her life fighting against. As she sat there, alone, the sounds of the precinct bustling outside her cell felt distant. Then the door clicked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, his voice softer than it had been earlier. "We're just confirming your identity," the officer said, almost cautiously. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. It's about time." The officer nodded, walking out briefly, his footsteps fading. Elena heard muffled voices, a phone ringing, and a few scattered words. Moments later, the door opened again, and this time, a new officer, someone she didn't recognize, stepped in. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice no longer carrying the same assertiveness, but a strange awe. "I need to make a call to the mayor's office. Just a moment, please." Elena remained silent, her eyes narrowing slightly. The officer was acting too strangely, his nervousness evident. He moved quickly, dialing a number, his voice trembling as he spoke into the phone. Elena Carter, yes, that's her, yes, head of the state civil rights department. No, sir, we didn't know. She's here. The words hit Elena like a shockwave. She had expected this moment, but hearing the officer's stunned disbelief made her realize how little the system understood the weight of the people they disregarded. The officer was saying her name, her position, as if the words carried an unfamiliar gravity. Minutes passed, but to Elena they felt like hours. Finally, the officer hung up the phone and looked at her, his face strained with guilt and confusion. "You're free to go," he said quietly. "We made a mistake." Elena stood, her body tense, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had learned long ago to wear her strength like armor, even in the face of injustice. As she was escorted out of the cell, the commotion from the rest of the precinct grew louder. Officers whispered to each other, casting sidelong glances, trying to piece together what had just happened. Matt Grayson, the officer who had arrested her, was still sitting at his desk, unaware of the magnitude of the situation. He was filling out paperwork when his supervisor, Captain Daniels, stormed into the room looking furious. "Grayson, my office." "Now," Captain Daniels barked. Matt stood up slowly, not sure what to expect. The precinct was buzzing now, an undercurrent of chaos filling the air. The reality was sinking in, but it hadn't hit him fully yet. In the captain's office, the door slammed shut behind him. Captain Daniels stood near the window, looking out at the precinct, his back turned. "You arrested her, didn't you?" Daniels' voice was icy. Matt hesitated. "Yeah, but it wasn't like she was—" Daniels turned, cutting him off. "She's Elena Carter, the head of the state civil rights department. You arrested a government official, Grayson. You don't get it, do you?" Matt's eyes widened in shock. His stomach dropped, and for the first time that night the weight of his actions hit him. His mind flashed back to the encounter, the way he had dismissed her so easily, the words he had thrown at her without thinking. I didn't know," he stammered. She didn't what? Make you feel like she's a threat?" Daniels interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's not just some random person. She's a leader, Grayson. She's someone who's been fighting for this very system to change, and you just dragged her in like she was nothing." Matt swallowed hard. The silence between them was thick, and for the first time, he felt completely exposed. "Get it together," Daniels continued. "You're lucky she hasn't made a bigger scene out of this, but that doesn't mean the consequences won't come." Matt stood there, staring at the floor, unable to find the right words. The precinct that had once felt so familiar to him now seemed foreign, like a mirror reflecting his own ignorance back at him. As he left the office, his mind raced. The walls around him seemed to close in, and for the first time he questioned everything he thought he knew about justice. Elena Carter wasn't just a name, she was a force, and he had just tried to break it. Matt's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the mayor's office. The door slammed shut behind him, echoing in the stillness. Mayor Walker stood by the window, staring out at the city below, his back rigid with anger. He didn't even acknowledge Matt's presence as the young officer stood awkwardly near the door. "Sit down, Grayson," the mayor finally muttered, his voice tight with fury. Matt hesitated before taking a seat, his stomach a tight knot. He had expected this meeting, but nothing could prepare him for the tension in the room. The mayor turned around, his face red and his eyes narrowed. "You know who you arrested, don't you?" Mayor Walker's voice was low but filled with a quiet rage. Matt swallowed. "Yes, sir, The mayor cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "You didn't just arrest any random woman, Grayson. You arrested Elena Carter, the head of the state civil rights department. You've caused a shitstorm, and I'm the one who's going to have to clean it up." Matt opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to process the gravity of what the mayor had just said. "You're not just dealing with a community leader here," the mayor continued, his tone biting. "You're dealing with someone who holds power, who's been working tirelessly for reform in this state. and you just threw her in a holding cell like she was a criminal. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" Matt's palms were sweaty. He had been so certain of his actions that night, so convinced he was in the right. But now everything felt like it was crumbling. The walls of the office seemed to close in on him as the mayor's words hit him harder than any slap ever could. "I didn't know, sir," Matt muttered, his voice shaky. She didn't tell me who she was. I didn't know she—" "Mayor." Walker's eyes blazed with anger. "That's the problem, Grayson. You didn't care to know. You didn't care to ask questions. You saw a black woman in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time and assumed the worst. And now look where we—" Already Matt's hands balled into fists. "I made a mistake, but I didn't—" "Shut up!" The mayor barked, slamming his fist against the desk. "You think this is just about you. You've humiliated the state, the department, and the entire community with your careless actions. And I can't fix it with a simple apology. The fallout is already spreading and we're losing control of the narrative. You don't just get to ignore that." Matt's chest tightened. His head was spinning. He knew this could destroy him, but the weight of the mayor's fury felt unbearable. The mayor paced the room for a moment, visibly working to control his anger. "We've already received calls from the governor's office, from the media, and from every civil rights organization in the state. You've made this personal, and now you're going to have to face the consequences." Matt opened his mouth, ready to argue, but the mayor held up a hand. "Just get out of my sight. We'll discuss what's next after we clean up the mess you've created." Matt nodded slowly, feeling as though the floor beneath him had shifted. He turned to leave, but before the door closed, the mayor called after him. "And Grayson, don't think for a second that this is over. You have no idea how deep this runs. This is just the beginning." As Matt left the mayor's office, his mind was reeling. His hands shook as he held the door open, and the precinct outside seemed suffocating. Officers shot him curious glances, and murmurs spread like wildfire. He could feel the eyes of the whole department on him. Meanwhile, across town, Elena sat in her sleek, minimalist office at the Civil Rights Department. Her phone rang incessantly, the constant buzz a stark reminder of how the news of her arrest had swept across the state. Her colleagues were furious. The legal teams were assembling. The press was already camped outside her office. Elena's hands were calm, though her thoughts churned. She had worked for years to build the reputation she now held, to become a respected figure in civil rights advocacy. She had fought against the system that had imprisoned her father, and she had never imagined, not in 1,000 years, that she would be on the receiving end of that same system's abuse. But now she was determined to make this right. She picked up the phone, dialing her lawyer's number with practiced precision. The call rang twice before a voice on the other end picked up. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," her lawyer said, his voice smooth and professional. "Elena, I need you to get to work. I want an apology and I want justice," she said, her voice steady. But there was an undeniable fire in her words. "This can't just be brushed under the rug." Her lawyer didn't hesitate. "I'll get on it right away. We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. I know you will. This is bigger than me," Elena said, her gaze drifting to the framed photo of her father on her desk, the man who had fought for justice even when the odds were stacked against him. "This is about all of us." As the phone call ended, Elena exhaled slowly. She didn't know what would come of this, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let Matt's actions define her. The real battle, the one that would change things for good, was just beginning. The media frenzy surrounding Elena's arrest had only grown in intensity. Her name was on every news outlet, and her face was a symbol for the thousands of people who had experienced the same injustice. Elena sat in front of a camera, poised but fierce as she spoke into the microphone. Her words were measured, but the weight of the truth she carried was clear in her eyes. "The system that arrested me," she said, her voice steady but full of passion, "is the same one that has been systematically targeting black people for generations. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who has been unfairly treated, profiled, and incarcerated simply because of the color of their skin. Her words hit the airwaves like a lightning strike. The press couldn't get enough of her. She was calm but resolute, a woman who had lived through the struggles she now spoke about. The media painted her as a beacon of strength, a leader in the fight for racial equality. As Elena's voice echoed through the airwaves, Matt was in a different kind of battle. The precinct had grown tense since his arrest of Elena. Whispers floated through the hallways, but the officers were careful with their words. Some supported him silently, believing that Elena's arrest was justified. But others, those who had seen the cracks in the system, were starting to question Matt's actions. Officer Davis, a seasoned cop who had been with the department for years, walked up to Matt as he sat in the break room, his hands nervously wrapped around his coffee cup. "Matt," Davis said quietly, "I've seen this before. You arrested the wrong person." Matt looked up, guilt clouding his features. "I didn't know who she was. It was just a routine arrest." Davis leaned in, lowering his voice. "You and I both know it was never about the arrest. It's about what she represents, the system you've been defending, the system that's always treated people like her, like me, like we don't matter." Matt's stomach turned. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down he knew Davis was right. Elena wasn't just another person he had detained. She was a force, a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for the very rights that he, as a police officer, had sworn to protect. Matt stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I need to get to work." But Davis didn't move. "The work is in here, Matt," he said softly, tapping his head. "The real work is deciding if you want to keep doing this job or if you want to be part of the solution." Matt's jaw clenched as he walked away, the words hanging in the air, suffocating him. He had been a cop for years, but this wasn't the kind of fight he had ever imagined. Back at the Civil Rights Department, Elena's fight was intensifying. She held meetings with her team, strategizing on how to push the issue further. Her phone rang off the hook, calls from reporters, politicians, even community activists who were rallying behind her. But in the quiet moments when the world outside seemed to pause, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at stake. The arrest wasn't just about her. It was about the system that had failed so many before her. It was about the generations of Black Americans who had been forced to fight for their basic rights. But for Elena, this had become personal. She had always believed that justice would come through policy and reform, but now she knew that sometimes it had to come through something more, something relentless. She sat at her desk, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Her thoughts drifted back to the night she was arrested. She hadn't fought. She hadn't yelled. She had remained composed because she had learned. Long ago, that fighting back in the moment was a luxury many didn't have. But now, the quiet war she was waging had taken on a different tone. She wasn't just fighting for reform. She was fighting for justice, for herself, for her community, and for every person who had ever been wronged by a system that wasn't built for them. And as the days passed, the divide between her and Matt deepened. She knew the truth of what had happened, but Matt was only just beginning to understand the cost of his actions. Matt spent his days on edge. He had no peace at home, no peace in the precinct. His colleagues were divided, and his own. Guilt weighed heavily on him. The one thing he had always believed in, his duty to uphold the law, felt more complicated now. He couldn't escape the reality that he had arrested a leader of the very cause he had chosen to ignore. The quiet war raged on, and neither side was ready to back down. Matt sat in his patrol car, the engine idling, but his mind raced. The weight of his actions was a constant pressure against his chest, a heavy, suffocating feeling that he couldn't shake off. The incident with Elena had never seemed so real until now, with the precinct divided and his colleagues whispering behind his back. Some were sympathetic, brushing it off as a mistake. Others, the ones who believed in the system, were silent, unsure how to act. It was one of those quiet moments in the precinct when Matt felt the weight of their stares. Officer Thompson, a young rookie who looked up to Matt like a mentor, had pulled him aside earlier that day. You should have called it in before you did anything, Matt, Thompson said, voice low, eyes scanning the hallway nervously. What were you thinking? I thought she was just another person violating the rules, Matt replied, frustration creeping into his voice. She fit the profile, all right? Thompson shook his head, disbelief in his eyes. That's not enough. You didn't even ask her. And now, look where we are. Matt's hands clenched around the steering wheel. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like this, not by someone who had been in the job for less than a year. His chest tightened as he imagined the stares of his other colleagues, the ones who had made their opinions clear. They were unsure how to handle the situation. Matt had always been confident in his role, but now he felt like he was standing on shaky ground. Elena, meanwhile, had not been idle. Protests erupted in the streets, led by her impassioned calls for justice. She marched with her people, speaking at rallies, using her platform to demand accountability. Her calm demeanor in the face of adversity contrasted with the raw emotion that poured from her speeches. But behind her strong facade, Elena was struggling with doubts. In a quiet office, the weight of her position became more apparent as she sat across from her lawyer, James. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a desk lamp, and Elena's tired eyes met his with a quiet resolve. I've been thinking, Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper. What if this is just another battle? Another fight I have to win, but at the cost of my peace. James leaned forward, concern creasing his forehead. What do you mean? You fought harder battles before, Elena. This isn't just about you. It's about a system that's been broken for too long. Elena closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and exhaled slowly, her voice distant. I know, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm doing this for the right reasons. I'm exhausted, James. Exhausted from fighting. Exhausted from never feeling like I can breathe freely. James understood the toll of being a public figure, a leader. The weight of expectations was a burden no one else could understand unless they'd been in her shoes. But he also knew that Elena had never been one to shy away from a fight, not when it mattered. I get it, he said gently. But think about what you're doing here. You're not just pursuing a personal vendetta. You're making sure this never happens again to anyone. It's bigger than just one wrong arrest. Elena nodded, her hands folding together tightly. She looked out the window, the night sky reflecting the uncertainty in her eyes. I have to do this, don't I? For all the people who are still suffering. For all the people who don't have the strength to stand up and fight. James smiled softly. You've always known what's right, Elena. Just remember, you're not alone in this. Her voice, barely audible, broke through the silence. It's about accountability. It has to be. As the conversation ended and James left her office, Elena sat there, conflicted but resolute. She had her doubts, but she couldn't turn her back on the mission. She couldn't let the system win. Back at the precinct, Matt's inner turmoil only deepened. He wanted to believe that what he had done wasn't a reflection of who he was. He wanted to believe that it was just a mistake, a misjudgment. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was more than that. It was the result of years of unconscious bias, years of upholding a system that had failed so many people, including Elena. The precinct was a pressure cooker now, with everyone sensing the brewing storm, and Matt felt trapped, unable to escape. The consequences of his actions. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The question that remained was, could he live with the truth of what he had done? Could he find a way to make things right? Or had he already gone too far? In Elena's world, the battle was only just beginning. She wasn't going to back down, not this time. The fight for justice was personal, but it was also a fight for everyone who had been forced to live under the shadow of injustice for far too long. The stakes had never been higher, and Elena was ready to face whatever came next. The national media buzzed with reports about the arrest. What had started as a local issue had turned into a spotlight on police practices across the country. Elena was invited to speak at rallies, town halls, and interviews, her every word dissected and broadcasted across various platforms. Her speeches were filled with passion, but they were also measured, carefully crafted to not only seek justice, but to call for long overdue change. The movement she had long been a part of had grown, not just because of her actions, but because she had become a symbol of a much larger struggle. Matt, on the other hand, sat at home on administrative leave. He had been stripped of his badge, his uniform, and his authority. No longer patrolling the streets, he had plenty of time to reflect, and with every passing day, his guilt deepened. He avoided the media, but his colleagues couldn't avoid him. Some still whispered their support for him, but most looked away, uncomfortable with the implications of the situation. Elena stood at the front of a packed hall, the energy in the room thick with anticipation. A public hearing had been called to address police practices with Elena as the star witness. The room was divided, some on her side, others still defensive of Matt. She was prepared, having fought this battle before, but there was a personal weight to it now. Matt had been summoned to appear as well. The moment he stepped into the room, the tension spiked. The eyes of the audience burned into him, but he kept his head down, trying not to feel the full force of their collective gaze. The hearing began with statements from various individuals, each offering their thoughts on police reform and racial injustice. Then it was Elena's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, her posture tall, her voice steady. "Thank you for this opportunity," Elena began, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Today, we are not just talking about one bad arrest or one officer's actions. We are talking about a system that has perpetuated injustice for far too long, a system that has been built on assumptions and prejudice. We are talking about the lives of people like me, and like so many others who have been dehumanized and criminalized by the very institutions that are supposed to protect us." Her words hung in the air as she paused, scanning the room. She could see the faces of the people who had supported her, some nodding, others wiping away tears, and the faces of those who weren't quite ready to change. Matt, sitting at the table across from her, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat when it was his turn to speak. I didn't believe my actions were racially motivated," he began, his voice shaky. "But I see now that they were. I made assumptions, and those assumptions were wrong. I arrested a woman who, as I now know, is an incredible person, a leader. But I didn't see her as that in that moment. I saw her as a threat, and that was wrong." There was a murmur in the room. Some applauded his honesty, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Elena looked at him, her expression a mixture of frustration and empathy. "I don't want your apology, Matt. I don't need your guilt. What I need and what so many of us need is a change, a real change in the way the system operates. This isn't about one mistake, one officer. This is about the culture that allows these mistakes to keep happening." Her words were piercing, but they weren't just a critique. They were a call for action. She wasn't only addressing Matt. She was addressing the whole room, and she was addressing the country. "The system needs to change," Elena continued, her voice now more impassioned. "And change starts with empathy. It starts with understanding that people like me are not your enemies. We are your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends. But we can't move forward if we keep treating each other as strangers. We need better training. We need accountability. We need to stop viewing the people we're sworn to protect as suspects." Matt lowered his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had heard the words before, but never like this. Never with this kind of urgency, this kind of pain. The hearing continued, but Elena's statement had already made its impact. She had spoken not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated, everyone who had ever been forced to live with the consequences of systemic racism. She didn't just want change for herself. She wanted it for the whole country. As the hearing ended, there were no immediate resolutions, but as Elena stepped off the stage, she felt a shift. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the momentum had shifted in her favor. The battle for justice had taken another step forward. In the silence of the room, Matt remained seated. He didn't know where the path ahead would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. Things couldn't go back to the way they were. It was time for change. For everyone. Matt's phone rang incessantly. Every call was either a threat or an insult, the voice on the other end filled with hate, with anger. Some called him a hero, others a racist, and neither side showed mercy. The hate mail piled up on his desk, letters filled with venom, some in bold, others in slanted handwriting, but all of them condemning him in one way or another. The tension in his home was palpable. He hadn't spoken to his wife in days, and his children had learned to avoid him. The noise of the world, the demands of people from both sides, had taken root inside him. He couldn't escape it. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the voices of the protesters, the calls for justice, and Elena's words echoing in his mind. He had made a choice that day, one that had shattered his life. But the guilt, it consumed him. His confidence, as an officer, his belief in the rightness of his actions, had crumbled. What had started as simple police work had turned into a full-scale public disaster. He stared at the letters again, the ones praising his bravery, and hated himself. Even more, he couldn't find peace. Elena, meanwhile, was finding strength in her fight. Her name was everywhere now, on the front page of newspapers, in articles about police reform, about racial profiling. She had received messages from fellow civil rights leaders, from activists, from entire communities who saw her as a beacon of hope. And for every kind word, there was a new rally to lead, a new speech to give. Elena had become the face of something much larger than herself, but she refused to let it consume her. She pushed forward, determined to see it through to the end. Still, the spotlight wasn't easy. It came with its own weight, its own challenges. The cameras, the interviews, the never-ending pressure. It was a constant battle. But where Matt crumbled, Elena found a different kind of resolve. Her anger had been replaced with something more measured, more strategic. She had made peace with her emotions, understanding that this was not about her personal struggle anymore. It was about the fight for justice. In her quiet moments, though, when the cameras weren't rolling, the pressure got to her too. There were times when she'd sit in her office staring at the wall, allowing herself a brief moment of exhaustion. But then the phone would ring, and it was back to the fight. She couldn't afford to falter, not now. As the days went by, Matt's breakdown became inevitable. His career, everything he had worked for, was slipping through his fingers. His uniform had been taken, his reputation destroyed. He was losing himself in the weight of it all. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to find himself at the center of a storm that he couldn't control. Late one night, after the constant phone calls had stopped, he sat alone in his car. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him, crushing his chest. He had lost more than his job. He had lost his sense of self. Elena was still fighting. But for Matt, the fight was over. He just hadn't realized it yet. The meeting was set in a small, sterile room, the kind used for official talks, but neither Matt nor Elena felt the professionalism of it. There was no mask of politeness here, no pretense, just raw tension, the weight of months of turmoil hanging heavy in the air. Matt sat across from Elena, his hands shaking slightly. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, but now that it was real, words seemed impossible. His eyes, once hard and filled with certainty, now held a deep, unrelenting remorse. His uniform was gone, but the shame of his actions still clung to him like a second skin. "Elena," he began, his voice hoarse, "I know words can't fix what I did, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I see now how wrong I was." Elena didn't respond right away. She simply sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering, but her expression unreadable. It had been weeks since the arrest, weeks since the protests, the media storm, and the endless battles. But the anger, the hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but there was something in the sincerity of his tone that gave her pause. "I didn't think," Matt continued. "I didn't think about the system, about the way I saw you, or the impact my actions would have. I was just doing my job. But now I realize how much harm I caused. Not just to you, but to everyone." Elena exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. The old wounds, the ones that had been buried for so long, were raw again. She thought about the countless times she'd seen the same kind of thing happen to others. The same assumptions, the same unjust arrests, the same pain. But this time it was different. It wasn't just some random officer, it was Matt, a man who had crossed her path in a way she never could have imagined. "You don't get to just fix it with an apology," Elena said quietly, her voice steady, though the words felt like they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "What happened to me, to people like me, isn't something you just walk away from. It's systemic. It's bigger than you and me. You don't get to erase that with a few words." Matt nodded slowly, understanding her words. "I know," he replied. "And I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I need to say this. I was wrong. I let my assumptions, my prejudice cloud my judgment. And I see now more than ever how that hurts everyone. I'll do whatever I can to make it right. I'm ready to change. I want to be part of the solution. I want to fight for the reforms you've been fighting for." Elena's eyes softened just a fraction, but she didn't let her guard down. "Change isn't easy," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not enough to say the right words. You have to live them. You have to act on them. It's not just about me, Matt. It's about the system that keeps perpetuating these injustices. I can't do it alone. I won't." "I know," Matt responded, his voice earnest. "And I'm not asking you to. I want to help. I want to be part of that change. I know I've messed up, but I swear I'm going to make it right." There was a long silence between them, the kind that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Elena's gaze flickered for a moment, her mind turning over his words. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But there was a sense of closure in the air, a recognition of the shift that had taken place. Matt wasn't the man he had been when he arrested her, and though Elena's journey was far from over, this conversation marked a turning point. "All right," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "I'll work toward justice, through the system. You're right about that. But we're both going to have to fight for it, and you need to prove that you're willing to do the same, starting now." Matt nodded, relief flooding him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. They both knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. As they left the room, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with the unspoken promise that they had to do more. They had to change. But for now, they both had found the first step toward healing. Months had passed since the day in that small, sterile room. The storm that had rocked Matt and Elena's lives had settled into a quieter, more hopeful rhythm, though the echoes of their past remained. Elena's days were filled with rallies, hearings, and strategy meetings. As the head of civil rights, her platform had grown even stronger, her voice louder. She continued to press for systemic change, focusing on police reform, community engagement, and racial justice. Her work was more than just a job now. It was her life's mission. Every day she spoke about the need for accountability, and the reforms she fought for were slowly starting to take root. Elena had always known the fight would be long, but now she saw the glimmer of progress. Meanwhile, Matt had left law enforcement. The pressure and guilt from his past had been too much to bear. His journey of self-reflection had led him to work in a civilian role for a nonprofit organization dedicated to building better relationships between the police and the community. It wasn't an easy road, but every conversation he had, every event he helped organize pushed him further away from the man he had once been. He was no longer the officer who had made the fateful decision to arrest Elena. He was trying, however imperfectly, to be part of the solution. The precinct, too, had started its transformation. Diversity and inclusion training had become mandatory for all officers, and new accountability measures were put in place to ensure better transparency. Some officers had left, unable to reconcile their old ways with the new policies, but others stayed and embraced the change. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still rocky, but the town was beginning to heal. Elena decided to visit the precinct one last time, to see for herself the changes that had been made. She walked through the doors of the station, her steps slow but purposeful. The officers who remained greeted her with respect, though some of them still carried the weight of their own biases. But Elena was no longer the same woman who had entered those doors months ago. She was stronger, more resolute, and more determined than ever. She stood in the middle of the precinct, looking around, taking in the new environment. The signs of change were subtle but undeniable. The diversity training materials were stacked neatly on desks, and the posters promoting equality and respect lined the walls. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Elena felt a flicker of satisfaction. She walked into the break room where a few officers were gathered, talking in hushed voices. When they saw her, the conversation fell silent, replaced by awkward stares. But Elena didn't let the silence rattle her. She nodded at them, offering a brief but genuine smile. "Change takes time," she said softly, almost to herself. Later, she made her way to the office that had once belonged to the precinct captain. It was now occupied by a new leader, someone who had come in with a fresh perspective on how policing should be done. The new captain stood, shaking Elena's hand, his demeanor respectful but humble. "I hope we can continue to make progress," Elena said, her voice filled with a quiet but firm conviction. "For the community, for everyone." The captain nodded. "We're committed to it. Every day is a step forward." Elena left the precinct with a sense of accomplishment, though she knew the battle wasn't over. Her role was bigger than just one case, one victory. She was fighting for the entire system, for generations of people who had been silenced, who had been wronged. But today, for the first time in a long while, she felt like the fight was worth it. As she walked out of the station, Elena felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. The scars would never fully fade. The wounds from the arrest, from the years of systemic racism, would always be there. But they no longer defined her. She had fought back, and in doing so, had ignited a spark of change. The town wasn't healed yet, but it was on its way. And for the first time in a long while, Elena was ready to keep fighting, for herself, for those who came after her, and for the future.